Crisis Control, brought to you by Zarelio. Cybersecurity experts protecting Australian businesses and organisations so we can all be safer together.
Hello, I'm Amber Sherlock and welcome to Crisis Control. In today's episode at Ransom, we'll examine why ransomware is increasingly the tool of choice for cyber criminals. How does it wreak so much damage? And what to do if your business is targeted. But first, what exactly is ransomware and what are the most common forms of attack?
It's the stuff of Hollywood movies. Criminals kidnapping a loved one, demanding huge payments for their return.
You have a 96-hour what? To never finding her.
No. Then there's the 2022 version. Criminal gangs stealing something else of value, data, and holding its owner to ransom.
It's essentially a way for criminals to be able to lock up a system so that it can't be used by individuals and ask those individuals for ransom money in order to be able to use their network again.
Criminals will usually deploy some form of malware into a company's systems, often via email. Once they've gained access, critical data, often with privacy implications, is copied and then the threats begin. It could be a simple requirement for the business to pay to get the data back, or the more significant threat of double extortion.
What actors are doing now is that they are doing their homework. They're in the reconnaissance phase. They suss out which companies that they're actually going to go after. And these companies are usually companies that can pay big bucks. They've got weak networks, or at least they have big bucks and they're worth doing more research into. Then they're looking at these companies and saying, where is the most valuable data? So instead of just encrypting the data, what they're doing is looking at these networks, finding their most valuable data, stealing that data, so taking a copy of that data, and then encrypting the computer systems so that the victims can't use their computer systems, then saying, hey, and in plain text saying, hey, look, this is what we've stolen. If you don't give us, pay the ransom, we are going to either release it publicly or sell it to your competitors.
Ransomware attacks account only for a small percentage of cybercrime attacks, but since they usually involve high-value targets, the impacts are outsized. In just the last year, we've seen hospitals, universities, transport links and food manufacturers all forced to shut down their networks, and therefore their whole operation, while they deal with a ransomware attack. The federal government's official advice is not to bow to the threats, but it's thought that rather than fighting the criminals, most companies simply pay up.
Joining me today is Alex Nixon from Kroll, Shane Bell from McGrath-Nicol and David Fairman from Netscope. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Let's start with you, Alex. The first question obviously is, why is ransomware increasingly the tool of choice for cyber criminals?
I think in recent years, one of the reasons that we have seen ransomware becoming more popular as a tool is because it's so readily available to attackers. Ransomware as a service is something that can be pretty much taken out of the box, good to go. So the skill required is very low for these attackers, and it's something that they can put to good use from their perspective and monetize.
Now, these days, a lot of organisations are prepared to respond and react to a ransomware attack. But should they be doing more to prevent it in the first place?
Yes, I think so. I think that if you have an incident response plan that's sitting there gathering dust, and then all of a sudden, ransomware hits, you absolutely are going to be caught on the back foot. Organizations need to have that resiliency mindset where they understand that it's not a case of if it will happen to them, but when it's going to happen to them. They need to be prepared to respond to a security incident, understand how their incident response plan runs and who are the key operators as part of that plan, and be good to go when it strikes rather than catching up to the attackers. Because as we know, particularly in ransomware cases, time is often of the essence.
I'll bring you in now, Shane. I see you nodding there. You agree?
I do. I think the focus historically, certainly when cybersecurity became a lot more mainstream, was on the actions that occur in the event. But I think it's pleasingly going in the right way, which is getting in front of it and trying to be prepared for an incident when it arises. I don't think there's no such thing as 100% prevention. So you absolutely need to be ready to respond and have muscle memory. But certainly I think the trajectory is to get in front of it with resilience.
Alex, what are some of the techniques that criminals are using to make their attacks more lucrative?
Well, it really depends. So I think that if they have an organization where they have a successful ransomware attack, something that we've seen is if those gaps are not closed, if those weaknesses are not addressed, that they will go back and try again. Unfortunately, there's not always honor amongst thieves. So it means that if you have been hit by a ransomware attack, you do know where there are vulnerabilities there, weaknesses in your organization. Make sure that you track that through to completion. Otherwise, you may well find yourself hit a second time around.
Shane, you look after frontline incident responder teams. What are the main ways that cyber attackers gain access?
Unfortunately, Amber, it's a lot of known vulnerabilities with known solutions that haven't been applied for various reasons. If you think about the complexity of most people's IT construct, their environment, there's a lot of moving parts to it, and unfortunately that has a lot of vulnerabilities in it. So a lot of the time access is being granted to these threat actors via known vulnerabilities with known solutions that just haven't been applied yet.
Can you talk us through a double extortion ransomware attack? What is it and what makes it so damaging?
A double extortion attack involves, I guess, two layers of threat or risk to the affected organisation. The first is encryption, and so that is that they've achieved access to a client's environment, and they've encrypted that, which means that they take it away from that organisation. So that causes an availability issue, and ordinarily as part of the attack they do what's called an exfiltration, which is essentially data theft. So they'll steal information that they think is valuable to the organisation, and then they essentially hold that to ransom independently of the systems being encrypted.
David, let's bring you in. Do you find many companies affected by these attacks were sufficiently prepared in the first place?
Look, I think that's a really hard question to answer. I think there is, there are a lot of companies that have good access, have good controls in place. They regularly practice their incident response procedures, but obviously there's different levels of maturity across organisations. There's been some very sophisticated organisations that have been subject to compromise and ransomware attacks. But I think there was a couple of points that have been made previously in here. One around, I think Shane made the point around muscle memory. I think that's really, really key. As you start to mature your organisation, and as organisations start to build out the maturity in this process, it's really about regularly exercising those incident response procedures. And it's not just about how do you respond to the incident. I think Alex mentioned around the key players, and really being clear around the decision-making process through that, through an event or through an attack.
Now, criminals are clearly doing their homework on potential victims. Talk us through some of the techniques they're using.
Yeah, look, there's a multitude of techniques. I think Alex mentioned crime as a service or ransomware as a service. I think that's really commoditized this attack vector for cyber criminals. It's really made it easy for organizations or criminals without the sophisticated skill sets to be able to profit from this exercise. They're also, we're also seeing threat actors compromising systems and organizations through real common basics. We have, Shane was talking about basic hygiene. How do we get better at basic hygiene, patching our systems, making sure that we don't have vulnerabilities in the live environment, making sure that we have secure application development processes. We understand our entire environment and our asset inventory. We understand what that attack surface looks like. These are the things that our threat actors are identifying. They're understanding that we don't have the the breadth and understanding of that environment, and they're using that as a way to attack us.
You're agreeing there, Shane?
Yeah, I think that there's a bit of a mystique around ransomware sometimes, that people think that it's always highly sophisticated and highly targeted, and some of it isn't. Some of it has been highly commoditized, and it's actually really easy out of the box, I think, as Alex said, to compromise an organisation, because there's known marketplaces on the dark web where I can buy credentials that are proven to work. I know the organisation that it's getting me access to. The malware that's used to execute ransomware is essentially kitted up, and you just execute it. So that's not a sophisticated attack. That's just leveraging some poor hygiene in an IT environment. But there are sophisticated attacks, and they're the ones that are of national security interest and those types of issues. So there really is sort of two flavours to it, where some of it's a little bit opportunistic, and some of it is very much geared towards targeted, sophisticated, ordinarily aligned to things like critical infrastructure and national security.
And what sort of percentage would you put that at, the less sophisticated versus the highly sophisticated?
Well, in my line of work, I see a lot more of the less sophisticated, a lot more of the... I think of it as it's like gangs that have decided that they're going to do something mischievous, and they've signed up to a code of conduct with some people that own a piece of ransomware malware, and they just go forth and execute that and see if they can get paid. It's pretty commoditized and pretty unsophisticated, and that's a lot of the ransomware that we see. Now, some of it might be politically motivated because of geopolitical issues and those types of things, but for the most part, it's a group of organised criminals that have gotten access to a piece of code that's going to do some damage that they're looking to get paid from. And
it does so much damage. So clearly companies aren't as prepared as they should be.
Yeah, I think that's difficult, and I think preparedness and resilience is obviously key. But at least contemplating ransomware and dealing with the IT hygiene issues, I would agree with you that is something that organisations really need to prioritise, because it's like swimming in numbers. The more people that are in the water, the less chance that all of those people can, unfortunately get attacked by a shark or something like that. It's you don't want to be the easy target. You want to be the hard target, and so doing the basics is really key to that.
Yeah, absolutely. David, when companies are victims of cyber attacks, look, most people want to keep it very quiet, but is this a good idea? Should we be talking about this more?
Yeah, look, I think this is a very hot topic and debated topic, but I think the information sharing and being more open about how we deal with incidents when we're attacked, so that we can learn from each other, I think there's a lot more benefit than there is in hiding it. I think some of the challenge and the attitude or the behaviour that we see about hiding it is because in some organisations, and depending on their industry, and if they're a regulated industry, sometimes they can be seen to be beaten up when there has been an issue, as opposed to how do we actually start to support organisations that have been proven to be vulnerable, that have been compromised? How do we demonstrate, or how do we come together as a community and as a society to show more support for that, as opposed to shaming and negatively impacting organisations that have been subject to this? We're all in this together. Cyber criminals are collaborating and working together. We should be doing the same, and we should be showing support together as an industry and across organisations.
Alex, do you agree with David?
I do. I think collaboration has to be the name of the game. I think that, especially as he rightly points out, in those regulated industries, there is a tendency for organizations to look like, if they say mea culpa, that they may well be the ones that are, in the press. They're having the negative ramifications that come with being the one that holds up their hands. And that absolutely shouldn't be the case. I think that we have to accept, as we said before, with that resiliency mindset, for us, it's not a matter of if it's us, but when it's us. So if we do collaborate and understand any patterns that may be emerging, then that means that from a holistic level in Australia, we will absolutely maintain better control of our cybersecurity infrastructure.
Alex, an often neglected aspect of ransomware is the implication for data privacy following an attack. The legislation can be pretty tricky to navigate, can't it?
It really can, and especially because organisations may well say, well, we feel fairly au fait with the Privacy Act here in Australia, but often that's not the only legislation that you're navigating. So of course, we do have APRA in Australia, but I'm also thinking about international legislation. It's not enough to say, well, we're an Australian-based organisation. If you have customers, for example, in the European Union and in the UK, then GDPR may well apply to you. And we do know that information commissioners have long arms and they have sharp sticks that they can beat us with. So whilst that may not be in the spirit of collaboration, that's absolutely a tool that they have at their disposal. I think with GDPR, the people like to talk about the 4% of global turnover is the potential fine. But what I think is potentially more concerning is the fact that they can come in and they can suspend your global operations while they're understanding exactly what's gone wrong. And I think I think if more organisations knew that was a potential ramification of not announcing a data breach in a timely manner, that they may well consider exactly what kind of data they're holding on who, and more importantly, where it's stored, so that if a ransomware attack does happen, they know very quickly if that data has been affected.
Shane, can you give us an example of a company that perhaps has been under attack but managed to avoid disaster and how they did that?
Yeah, I think, well, maybe not organisation specific, but certainly there's organisations that navigate cybersecurity issues routinely, and you don't read about it, and that's because they're leveraging processes that exist, and they've got muscle memory, they've built resilience, all of the things that we're talking about. I would argue that say many of the big banks in Australia, for example, that have invested heavily in cybersecurity, have big teams, have structured their external support through the specialists that they bring into that portfolio of defence and resilience, would routinely deal with issues, and it isn't read about because they're leveraging those processes. And so I think that is a measure ordinarily of a well-handled incident, is one that just defaults to the process that's in place and isn't necessarily made too public or needs to be spoken about, and then you're in control of the message, as David's saying, in collaboration forums where you can actually learn from each other how to do that, as opposed to having to try to manage a message that you've lost a little bit of control over. Now,
banks sound like quite a likely target, but are there particular companies that are being targeted, or is it just across a wide range?
Yeah, I think so the lens that I spoke about before in terms of sophisticated and unsophisticated, I think sort of dictates that as well. Obviously, financial services institutions are data rich, and so therefore are a target, but have also invested quite heavily over a period of time in their capabilities. So what's becoming increasingly important to organisations like that is their supply chain, because if I can't break into a bank, for example, because a bank is highly resilient, then I might try to break into people that are trusted by the bank because their level of resilience might be lower. And so supply chains have become a real issue. But unfortunately, on the unsophisticated side, it is a little bit drive-by. If you are connected to the internet, you have systems that are connected to the internet, and your credentials are compromised historically, and you've got known vulnerabilities, then unfortunately you're a target, and you really need to tighten that up.
If we look at the details, what percentage of companies actually get their data back after a ransomware attack?
Yeah, I think that varies, and I think it stems from who actually pays in the first instance. In my experience, getting data back from a threat actor isn't all that common. What they say that they will do is just not publish it. So it's not necessarily I'll give to you what I took from you. It's more, if you pay me, I won't publish it. So it's less about the transaction of giving it back. I've actually seen instances on incidents historically where through the negotiation process, a question's been asked, can we have a copy of the data back so that we can verify what you're saying? And the threat actor actually replied to that saying, no, that would be in contravention to our privacy policy. So
the irony.
Yeah, it's really quite interesting.
Yeah.
So it's not about necessarily the data back, it's more about it not being published. And so then the percentage that you're talking about is how many people pay the ransom to maybe provide themselves with that level of assurance. And that stat's somewhere around 80 to 90% at the moment of, certainly in my experience and in some of the research that I've been part of, are at least contemplating paying the ransom, if not paying it.
Okay, David, look, no one is immune from a cyber attack, but what can companies do to be more resilient?
Look, I think there's a few things. They should be thinking about, one, do they understand their critical business processes? Do they understand the applications and the systems that support those business critical processes? Do they understand who has access to those systems? Do they understand what those vulnerabilities are across those systems? And are they doing something about those vulnerabilities in a timely manner? There's that piece, which is more the defense and the protect piece, but there's also a piece around, well, let's, we understand that there is a high likelihood that we will be impacted in some way, shape or form. How do we respond to that? So assuming that breach condition, what are the critical systems? Make sure we have immutable backup so that we can get our data back from a known good backup. Ensure that you have robust response plans, procedures, during the containment of an incident, reduce the blast radius, contain the threat actor within the environment. The point that was made earlier is, we were talking about, breaking into an organization. And if you think about the large sophisticated, the banks as an example, they're probably dealing with an incident every day, if not multiple times a day. But there's a difference between a compromise and an actual breach. And I think those strong detect and response processes demonstrate the importance of what it takes to defend an organization. And those processes, techniques, should be practiced day in, day out. Now, some of those large organizations are practicing that day in, day out because of their operations. And if you're not doing that, you should make sure that you're robustly doing that on a regular basis, coming back to that muscle memory conversation that we had earlier.
Alex, just lastly today, one more question. How prepared are Australian companies for cyber attacks? What more could they be doing?
I think that one of the key things that we're seeing quite a lot of organisations getting quite interested in revisiting is the topic of the what we can call the last line of defence, which is their people. So Cyber did a bit of research that found that there's a real significant return on investment whenever you invest in appropriate and engaging security awareness training. We know a 5x on the investment, which I think is substantial, because of course we see that it's often an engaged employee, an employee that understands the high value that they have to the organisation, or the high risk, depending on how you want to look at it. They're often the ones that alert us to these attacks or these attempted attacks, and they're often the ones that, as a result, can ensure that we can respond quickly and mitigate as David said, the blast radius.
And that's all we have time for today. Thank you to Alex, Shane and David for your time. Now let's ask a CISO.
Hi, I'm Victor Akari. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer of Cochlear Limited. Yes, I think cybersecurity has increased in importance across many organisations in the last few years, and there's a couple of key drivers here. So first of all, boards and senior executives are looking a lot closer at the cyber controls of their organisations. As any CISO or CIO will tell you, when they go in to present to their boards, they're getting asked a lot more questions than they used to in the past. And boards are also seeking independent verification from external auditors just to make sure those controls are in place and operating effectively. So another key driver is the fact that cyber criminals have had to change their tech over the last few years and target industries they didn't normally in the past. So traditionally they went after high value targets such as government departments, where they went after trade or state secrets, and financial services companies for banking and credit card numbers. But those industries are quite highly regulated and have had good security controls for some time now. As a result, the attackers had to change tack and go after organisations which didn't generally have good controls or a very robust cyber program. And using attacks like denial of service and ransomware, they're able to disrupt those organisations' manufacturing lines, operational systems, supply chains, and online services, and then demand payment to stopping those attacks. Even making it worse, they would look at things like exfiltrating their data and then selling it back to them, or offering to sell that on the market for a price. Another key driver is supplier risk management. So most corporates or enterprises will have a supplier risk management program in place where they vet the security controls and the risk posture of the third parties they do business with, exchange data with, or grant access to their network. Now, unfortunately, smaller organisations and even startups are now being vetted in the same way when they want to sell products or services to those enterprises. Now, these are small businesses that didn't really have security programs or even cybersecurity personnel on their books, having to respond and reply to the same questions that large enterprises were having asked to answer. And the final key driver would be cyber insurance. Now, as most executives will tell you, cyber insurance premiums are on the rise and have been for a few years now. Now, the primary reason for that is the fact that the number of successful attacks that have occurred and the payouts that insurers have had to make to cover things like investigation costs and ransomware payments should they be made. So putting that into perspective, yes, I believe cybersecurity is increasing in importance across many organisations and will continue to do so for some time. That will put an even greater strain on the scarce resources we have in the cybersecurity field and will force organisations to focus their cybersecurity budget where they can get the best bang for their buck.
And that wraps up Crisis Control for this week. I'm Amber Sherlock. Thanks for watching.
Crisis Control, brought to you by Xerilio. Cybersecurity experts protecting Australian businesses and organisations so we can all be safer together.